Hi, I'm Mark from Kicker, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how you can use Kicker software to create your pre-flop ranges, both opening and also calling, with a little bit of raising thrown in as well. So there are two different ways that you can go about trying to approach building ranges. The first one, which is the one I'm going to show you first of all, is to go to the pre-flop range builder. So this is on the main screen on Kicker. You go to pre-flop range builder. You then get this view here, which shows you all of your opening positions and a little thumbnail of how that range is configured at the moment. Now, obviously, you can see that the positions here are everything from under the gun 10-handed all the way around to the small blind 10-handed. But you don't need to define all of these positions. In fact, you don't need to define any of them because you can, as I'll show you later, create kind of ad hoc, custom or bespoke ranges. But if you use this view here, what this allows you to do is create kind of your default opening ranges. And if you only played, say, 6-handed like I often do, you don't need to worry about these first 4 positions. You can just ignore them and just focus on going from the low jack all the way around to the small blind. But what this does allow you to do is define what you would typically do in the typical games that you play if you are, say, in the low jack, opening from the low jack, say 6-handed in a cash game, which might be what you regularly do. As you can see here, I've cleared out the button range that did have a range in it previously, but I'm going to show you how you can use the interface in order to be able to define an opening range. So if I click on this, it takes you to this view here. This kind of grid, if you've used any sort of poker software in the past, like Poker Stove or anything like that, really, you'll probably recognize this sort of grid. It shows the pre-flop hands that you can have. All the offsuit hands are in the bottom left-hand quadrant, and all the suited hands are in the top right-hand quadrant, and we have pocket pairs coming down the middle. It is slightly color-coded, just skewing towards strength, so the stronger a hand, the darker it is. And on this view here, you can define ranges in a number of ways. So the first way is you can use this slidey bar here, and this will just fill in ranges all the way up to 100% if you like. However you want to use this slidey bar, it uses the Sklansky-Carlson hand rankings, which I think is how each of those hands performs against a random hand, just heads up. So this ranking does seem to be skewed heavily towards pocket pairs and aces, and then it kind of starts filling in the other hands as you come down. It may or may not be useful for you, but as a kind of rough starting point, if you wanted to open with, say, 20% of hands, you could bung it up to about there, and then you could go in and say, okay, well, actually, for the sort of hands I do, I don't really bother with those aces, but I might want to look at these suited Broadway hands, and I might want to add in some suited connectors, and maybe even a couple of suited gappers, and maybe king 9 suited, and get yourself up to 20% that way. But the slidey bar just gives you a starting point. You'll see here as well that as you fill in these hands, it gives you the shorthand text here that you can use. So you can actually go into this view here if you want, and just copy that, Control-C from the keyboard, and then you can go and paste that into other packages such as Poker Stove, as I just mentioned, or other packages that use this shorthand notation. You can also go to other packages and take shorthand text like this and paste it in, and you can do set from shorthand. Obviously, I'm just pasting in what I just copied, but if that had come from another package, a different range could be imported here. Other ways that you can build ranges, you can use these buttons here. So I'm going to just clear the range, and I'm going to click Broadway. So you can see if you click Broadway, then it will select all the Broadway cards. You can select, if I clear again, you can see that you can do suited Broadway, unsuited Broadway. You can do pocket pairs. You can do suited aces, unsuited aces, suited connectors, suited gappers. You can even select all if you want. So yeah, again, you may well not want a range that is Broadway on its own, but you can use it as a starting point. You might say Broadway and suited aces and maybe pocket pairs and suited connectors, and then depending on exactly what the range was, you might knock out some of these low ones and maybe knock out some of these here, and then maybe add in something like that. It gives you the flexibility to do all of that. Another thing that you should bear in mind is that you don't have to bet the hands all of the time. It may be that, for example, this is an early position range, and maybe you don't always open with pocket deuces, but you do like to sometimes, just to give yourself some board coverage. So what you can do in that case is you can say, I'm going to open with pocket deuces 50% of the time. And that means that this range, as it gets carried forward to the flop and beyond, it will only have half of the combos of pocket deuces. And the way that that works internally in the software is not that it will take, the two of diamonds and the two of clubs and the two of diamonds and the two of hearts and the two of diamonds and the two of spades. It doesn't work like that. It just takes 50% of all of the combos. Effectively, it just weights them by 50% rather than 100% as it goes through and uses that range for analysis later on. So in terms of equity strength, when it uses them in the calculations later, it's assuming you only have these combos half the time rather than 100% of the time, like with all of these other ones. It's worth bearing in mind as well that when you do define a partial range for a combo, that doesn't affect the shorthand text. The shorthand text will just say pocket deuces is included if it's included at all. That's just the way that works at the moment. And of course, you can just select the fold button as well if you decide you just want to fold it out completely, and it'll drop to 0%. There are a couple of other useful subscreens that you can go to here. So if we just clear this range, I'm not going to dwell on these because they're not strictly part of how this screen works. But if we just go to the pre-flop player pool tendencies, this is also known as the population pool. I have nearly 1 million hands that I've uploaded here. And you can see of them, there are about 500,000 that were six-handed. And what this is showing me is the tendencies of the player pool from different positions. So you can see that the player pool is opening 21.6% of the time from the low jack. And the response to that is the hijack is calling when the low jack opens 10% of the time, and is raising when the low jack opens 5% of the time, or 5.6% of the time, and so on. And you can see how the cutoff responds to a low jack open, and the button responds to a low jack open, and so on. And then you can see when the hijack opens, how the cutoff responds, and when the hijack opens, how the button responds, and so on. You've got all the percentages here. And what this is useful for in the context of defining your pre-flop ranges is that if you were, say, trying to define a range for a villain, you could come and look at this and think, okay, well, I say you don't have any specific reads on the villain, you don't have any HUD stats on the villain, but you know that they form part of this player pool, the population, and you want to see how often they open from, let's say, the button. Well, we can pop down here and you can see that the button open is 46.5% for an average player. So therefore you can put the villain on a range that is about 46% of all hands. If you think that the villain is likely to be part of the typical player pool, as I say, if you don't have any reads on them, you can also have a look at responses. So let's say you decide to open from the button, but then the villain calls you from the small blind. Well, you can see from this player pool population that the small blind is calling 13% of the time. The small blind is raising 12% of the time. So you can use that information, and in a minute I'll show you how you can define calling stroke raising ranges as well, which is very similar to this but slightly different. The other useful thing you can use here is the hand history tool, which I will go to here. So what this is I'm just going to pick out here six-handed opening from the button. What this is because this is a selection of my hands from my hand history. You can see that these are the hands that I actually opened with from the button. And when I was six-handed, and there are a couple of restrictions here. So only when the stack size was 30 big blinds or higher, so the hero stack size, and between these two, in fact this is between the top and bottom possible. You can restrict this. You could decide to say, well, actually I only want to look at hands where I opened between 1 and 4 big blinds, let's say, which actually I don't think has made much difference. There were very few hands that I opened wider than that. These were probably just pre-flop shoves. So you can see via this, there's a heat map effect going on here that shows you the hands you opened with all the time are in this kind of deep bluey purple colour, and then they become lighter, more like a lilac colour as they were opened with less frequently, and eventually they become a kind of grey colour if they're only opened with once or twice or 3 times, let's say. And if they're this kind of very, very light blue colour, they weren't opened with at all. And so what you can do is you can use this slidey bar here, and you can slide it up to, say, I don't know, 20% here. Because what that does is it just knocks out the hands that you opened with very, very infrequently. So any hands that you opened with less than 20% of the time are now just removed from this range. You could slide it up to, say, 50%, so you're only looking at the hands that you opened with at least half the time. Or you might want to include all of them. Or you might want to go somewhere in between, somewhere like this. I mean, something like this probably does represent a fairly accurate idea of my opening range. You can see I was opening with unsuited aces quite a lot of the time, although not all of the time. I might want to put some of those in as partials maybe, but certainly pocket pairs all the time, most Broadway, a couple of the Broadway ones not so often, and then some of these suited kings and queens and jacks a little bit haphazardly here. But what you can do is you can say okay, and then it will transpose that range, not with any weightings, just with anything that was on in that heat map is now on here. And you can go in and you can just tidy it up and say, well, actually, I probably shouldn't have been opening with those, and maybe not those, and maybe we want to knock out those, maybe leave these because these can make a wheel and so on, and maybe knock out some of these bottom ones. But you're just getting a rough idea of what your range actually was. And also you can use that heat map as a way to try and discipline yourself into opening with the hands that you're supposed to be opening with. So now I'm going to show you how you can define calling stroke raising ranges. So obviously here we were looking at the opening ranges. If we go to this view here, you can see it's calling stroke raising ranges. If we assume villain is in the low jack, selected from this drop down list here, and you can see that we've got various response positions here, hijack, cutoff, button, and so on. If we assume that the villain is on the button, then you can see we've got the small blind and the big blind. I've already defined something for the big blind. If we select small blind here, you'll see it's a similar view to before. The difference is that you've actually got calling and raising rather than opening here. So you can decide what your calling range is, maybe using a slidey bar, but then over the top of that you can also select raising hands, which are defined in purple here. So obviously, you know, if you're in a position where you might think you might raise tens and higher, and maybe ace king suited, ace king off, ace queen suited, ace queen off, then you can put them in like that. Another thing you can do is you might decide, let's say for aces, that you're not going to raise 100% of the time. You're going to raise 75% of the time, and 25% of the time you're going to call. You can do that. You can also, if you wish to, define combos that are partially called, partially raised, and partially folded. And there may be some circumstances where that might be appropriate. But you can go through and you can set everything up like that. And you can see here that it gives you the percentages for the total starting hands called, total starting hands raised. And similarly, like before, you can use the pre-flop player pool tendencies in order to be able to have a look at what the player pool is doing pre-flop, and then use those percentages to inform how you might define ranges here. It's worth bearing in mind as well that this shorthand text here is only for the calling here, and when these ranges get taken forward into scenarios, they're only really interested in the calling, because anything to do with re-raising would then have the action back on your opponent, and then your opponent would have to either call or raise and so on. But what we end up with in the scenarios is ranges that were opening versus calling, because that's what we follow through in the scenarios. So all the stuff that's marked in purple here is really just for information that they are the raising ranges. If you were to then go to the opponent and have a look at what the calling range was against the raising ranges here, and then you were to go ahead with that, then you would come back in and define the range as all of the hands that you've defined here as raising for the opening range for this player, in order to be able to carry those through the scenario. There is another way that you can get to these ranges, which I'll just show you. So from the main screen here, if you select Start New Scenario, it takes you to this view here, and this is where you can actually construct a scenario yourself. You can also get to this view by selecting a hand from a hand history that's been played by double clicking on it, and it will pre-populate some of this stuff for you. But in this case here, let's just do, we'll pick random flop cards. So you can see here it's picked 8 of diamonds, 8 of clubs, 5 of clubs. And let's just pick a random hero hand, pocket jacks here. Now you can pick your hero range and your villain range. We've said here that the stacks are 100 and 100 and the pot's 7.5 and that the hero's in position. If you use the left mouse button on this hero range, it will take you to this view here, which allows you to pick ranges. So you can see here that we've got 10-handed ranges defined. Now these ones at the top are just the ranges that are just picked from the other view that we saw when we were looking at the other screen with all the different positions on the table. This is just a different view onto the same ranges here, and you can actually have a look at these ranges like that. That button range is the one I defined earlier on, for example. You can use copy range if you want to copy that and then paste it into these bespoke or custom ranges that we have down here. So but another way you can do it, you can select those if you wanted. So if we want to go back to that button range there, we can select it and say OK, and then it will just select that for the hero range for this particular scenario. If I click that again, the one I've just selected, it takes me to just this view and just allows me to edit this range just as a one-off for here. So we've taken it from the predefined button open range, but we're now free to change this however we like, and it won't affect the stored button opening range. If instead we wanted to actually go back to that view to actually go and to the tree view and pick other ranges or define more ranges, if you hold down the shift key and press the left mouse button, it takes you back to this view again. And within here you can define whatever ranges you want. You can define folders. So if I add a folder here and I'll call it demo ranges, and just like in Windows, it will create you a folder. And then within demo ranges here, if we say we want to add a range and we call this range demo range hero open, but obviously you can call it whatever you like. And then we go to edit range, then you're back to this view again, the same view that we were looking at earlier on. So I'll just very quickly just pick a quick range here. It's probably not very realistic, but just so we've got one. So we've got a range there. You can see that's demo range hero open. We say OK, and there's that range. And again, you can either click in it and edit it if you like, just using the left mouse button, or hold down the shift and press that button, and you can see that you're back into this view again. And if you decided you wanted to pick something else from here, because that's the demo range we had, you can do. For the villain range, same sort of thing. If you left click when nothing is defined in these ranges, by the way, it will take you by default to this bespoke or custom range editor screen. If you want to define a calling stroke raising range, as we would want to here, if we go back to demo ranges and we select that and say add range, but before we do, if we uncheck opening here, so we say add range, and this range we call demo villain calling range. Select OK. Now when we select edit, you'll see it's got the call and the raise, exactly like we had when we'd selected it from the other view. And we can do a similar sort of thing here, where we select that range and then say OK, and then we've got the hero range and the villain range. We've got our flop, we've got our hero hand, so now we can select analyze, give the scenario a name, and it will run the calculations for us and give us our equities. The action is on the villain out of position. You can see it's still got the hands marked in purple here. In fact, if you click on these, it will give you an exploded view of them, just so you can see in detail what's going on. It's got those in purple, but they are just deprecated as you move through the scenario. Then they're not considered to be hands that you've opened with, because obviously you would have raised with those hands, so the villain doesn't have those hands at this point. Thank you very much for watching.